The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Michael Thompson adjusted his red tunic for the final time. After 15 years of service, today marked his last day as a Queen's Guard. The iconic bearskin hat felt heavier than usual, not from its physical weight but from the emotion he carried knowing this would be his final posting at the palace gates. Thompson had joined the Grenadier Guards straight from school, drawn by the honor and tradition of protecting the royal family. He had stood motionless through countless ceremonies, endured tourists trying to make him laugh, and weathered every season in his pristine uniform. The discipline required was extraordinary. Guards were trained to remain absolutely still, eyes fixed straight ahead regardless of what happened around them. Breaking character was strictly forbidden and could result in serious consequences. As the changing of the guard ceremony approached, Thompson noticed an elderly woman in a wheelchair being pushed slowly along the palace railings by a younger man who appeared to be her son. The woman wore a faded military jacket covered in medals, and her weathered hands gripped a small photograph. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had traveled a great distance for this moment. The crowd of tourists began to gather, cameras ready to capture the famous ceremony. Thompson took his position, shoulders back, rifle at his side, preparing for the 40-minute ritual that had remained unchanged for centuries. The band struck up the familiar marching tune as the new guard approached from Wellington Barracks. But something about the elderly woman caught Thompson's attention. Despite his training to ignore distractions, he found his gaze drawn to her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stared at the palace gates. The photograph in her hands showed a young soldier in a uniform similar to Thompson's own, likely from decades past, judging by the sepia tone and formal pose. The woman's son knelt beside her wheelchair and spoke softly in her ear. Thompson couldn't hear the words, but he watched as she nodded and clutched the photograph closer to her chest. There was something profoundly moving about her presence, a quiet dignity that spoke of sacrifice and service. As the ceremony progressed, Thompson learned more about the woman from fragments of conversation he overheard from nearby tourists. Her name was Margaret Harrison, and she was 93 years old. She had traveled from Scotland to visit the palace where her late husband had once served as a guard over 60 years ago. This was her first time seeing the ceremony since his death, and according to her son, it would likely be her last due to her declining health. The changing of the guard continued with military precision. Orders were barked, rifles were shouldered, and the new guards marched into position. Throughout it all, Thompson maintained his stoic expression, but inside, his heart was breaking for the elderly woman. He understood the weight of service, the pride that came with wearing the uniform, and the sacrifice that military families made. Margaret Harrison's husband, Private James Harrison, had served with distinction during the Korean War before being selected for the prestigious role of Queen's Guard. He had stood on these very steps, protecting the same royal family, upholding the same traditions. According to the stories Thompson had heard whispered among the tourists, James had spoken often of his time at the palace, describing it as the greatest honor of his military career. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Thompson faced a decision that would define not just his final day of service but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor. The rules were clear. Guards must remain motionless and emotionless at all times. Breaking character was unthinkable, a betrayal of centuries of tradition. Yet as he looked at Margaret Harrison, Thompson saw something that transcended rules and regulations. He saw a woman who represented the very values he had spent 15 years protecting. Her husband had stood where Thompson now stood, had worn the same uniform with the same pride, had served the same crown with the same dedication. The final moments of the ceremony approached. Soon, Thompson would march away from the palace gates for the last time, his service complete. But he couldn't bear the thought of leaving this elderly veteran's widow without some acknowledgement of her husband's service and her own sacrifice. The band played the final notes of the march. The ceremony was officially over. Tourists began to disperse, taking their photos and souvenirs. Margaret Harrison's son started to push her wheelchair away from the railings, preparing to leave. It was then that Thompson made his choice. In a moment that would be remembered by everyone present, He did something that no Queen's Guard should ever do. He broke character. Stepping forward from his position, Thompson removed his bearskin hat, a gesture strictly forbidden while on duty. With his hat held respectfully at his side, Thompson walked the few steps to where Margaret Harrison sat in her wheelchair. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the other guards, though they maintained their positions, watched with amazement as their colleague abandoned protocol. Thompson knelt beside Margaret's wheelchair, bringing himself to her eye level. With infinite gentleness, he spoke words that would echo through the hearts of everyone who witnessed this moment of pure humanity, breaking through the rigid formality of royal protocol. The simple act of a guard stepping out of line would normally result in disciplinary action, but this was different. This was a moment when the true spirit of service, compassion, respect, and honor proved more important than any rule or regulation. Thompson's decision to break character wasn't a failure of discipline. It was the ultimate expression of what it meant to serve with dignity and humanity. The words that Sergeant Thompson spoke to Margaret Harrison were simple, but they carried the weight of 60 years of military tradition and respect. "Mrs. Harrison," he said softly, his voice barely audible to those nearby. "Your husband's service to the crown and country will never be forgotten. Thank you for his sacrifice and thank you for yours." Margaret's weathered hands trembled as she reached out to touch Thompson's sleeve. Her eyes, clouded with age but bright with emotion, met his with a recognition that transcended words. Here was a young man who understood what her James had given to his country, who respected the uniform and the duty it represented. The crowd of tourists, initially shocked by the guard's unprecedented action, began to realize they were witnessing something truly special. Cameras that had been raised to capture routine ceremony photos now focused on this extraordinary moment of human connection. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the soft whisper of wind through the palace trees. Thompson gently took the photograph from Margaret's hands, studying the image of Private James Harrison in his pristine guard uniform. The young soldier in the sepia photograph bore the same serious expression, the same proud bearing that Thompson had cultivated during his own years of service. It was like looking at a reflection across time, a bridge between past and present. "Service. He would be so proud to know you're here," Thompson continued, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "This palace, these gates, they remember every man who has stood guard here. Your husband's watch continues through all of us who follow." Margaret's son David watched in amazement as the formal guard knelt beside his mother. He had worried about bringing her on this difficult journey from Edinburgh, concerned that her frail health might not withstand the trip. But seeing her, face now, illuminated with joy and recognition, he knew they had made the right decision. Other guards in the vicinity faced their own internal struggle. Protocol demanded they maintain their positions and ignore the scene unfolding just yards away. Yet each man felt the pull of Thompson's actions, understanding that their colleague was honoring something deeper than regulations. The bonds of military brotherhood, the respect for those who had served before them, and the recognition of sacrifice made by military families created a tension between duty and humanity. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, the officer commanding the guard detail, had been observing the ceremony from a distance when Thompson's breach of protocol caught his attention. His first instinct was to intervene immediately, to restore order and discipline to the ranks. But as he moved closer and heard Thompson's words to the elderly woman, Mitchell found himself frozen between his duty as an officer and his recognition of what was truly happening. Mitchell had served for 25 years and had never seen a guard break character during an official ceremony. The regulations were clear and violations serious. Yet as he watched Margaret Harrison's face transform with joy and gratitude, as he saw the profound respect in Thompson's gesture, Mitchell realized he was witnessing something that transcended military protocol. The crowd had grown larger as word spread that something unusual was happening at the palace gates. Visitors pulled out phones to record the scene, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and shared far beyond this day. Some tourists began to understand the significance of what they were seeing, a serving soldier paying Respect to the memory of a fallen comrade's service. Thompson carefully handed the photograph back to Margaret, ensuring her fragile fingers had a secure grip before letting go. He then did something that would make this moment even more memorable. From his jacket pocket he retrieved a small pin, the regimental badge of the Grenadier Guards. Without hesitation, he pressed it into Margaret's palm. "From all of us who serve now to honor all who served before," Thompson said, closing her fingers gently around the badge. "Your husband earned his place in our history. This belongs with his memory." The gesture was not just personal but symbolic. The regimental badge represented centuries of military tradition, battles fought and won, lives given in service to the crown. By giving Margaret this token, Thompson was acknowledging that her husband's service was part of that unbroken chain of duty and honor. Margaret's response was immediate and heartfelt. Through tears that had been building since she first saw the palace gates, she whispered, "James always said the guards were more than soldiers. He said they were guardians of something precious. Now I understand what he meant." Her words struck Thompson with unexpected force. In 15 years of service, he had focused on the discipline, the precision, the unwavering dedication required of a Queen's Guard. But Margaret's simple statement illuminated a truth he had felt but never articulated, that their role was indeed about guarding something precious. Not just the physical safety of the royal family, but the continuity of tradition, respect, and honor that bound past and present together. David Harrison, Margaret's son, stepped forward and shook Thompson's hand with genuine emotion. "Sergeant," he said, "my father died when I was 12. I never really understood what his military service meant until today. Thank you for helping me see him through your eyes." The ripple effect of Thompson's action continued to spread through the crowd. Other visitors began to share their own stories of military service, of family members who had served, of the importance of honoring those who had worn their country's uniform. What had begun as a tourist attraction had become an impromptu memorial to service and sacrifice. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell made his decision. Rather than reprimand Thompson for breaking protocol, he would allow this moment to continue. Sometimes, he realized the spirit of service was more important than the letter of regulations. Sometimes humanity needed to triumph over procedure. This was one of those times. As Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell approached the scene, the gravity of the situation became even more apparent. News of the Guard's unprecedented action had begun to spread beyond the immediate crowd through social media posts and phone calls. Within the palace administration, phones were ringing as officials tried to understand what was happening at the gates. Mitchell had served long enough to know that this incident would require careful handling. The British military's reputation for discipline and protocol was built on centuries of unwavering adherence to regulations. Yet as he observed Thompson's respectful interaction with Margaret Harrison, Mitchell found himself thinking about his own father, who had served in the Royal Navy during World War II. "Sergeant Thompson," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying the authority of command but lacking the harsh edge that might have been expected. Thompson immediately stood at attention, though his face showed no regret for his actions. The crowd watched nervously, wondering if the touching scene they had witnessed was about to be followed by a harsh reprimand. "Sir," Thompson replied crisply, maintaining eye contact with his commanding officer. He had accepted from the moment he broke character that there would be consequences. His military career had been built on following orders and maintaining discipline. Today, he had chosen a different path. Mitchell surveyed the scene. The elderly woman clutching the regimental badge, her son beaming with pride, the crowd of tourists who had been moved to tears by what they had witnessed. He thought about the official reports he would need to write, the explanations he would need to provide to his superiors, and the precedent that might be set by his response to this situation. "Mrs. Harrison," Mitchell said, addressing Margaret directly, "I am Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, commanding officer of this guard detail. I understand your husband served as a Queen's Guard many years ago." Margaret nodded, her voice still shaky with emotion. "James Harrison, sir. He served from 1962 to 1965. He always said it was the greatest honor of his life, standing guard for Her Majesty. Mitchell's expression softened noticeably. Those were the years immediately following the construction of the Berlin Wall, when tensions with the Soviet Union were high, and the symbolic importance of the Queen's Guard was particularly significant. James Harrison had served during a time when every guard duty had deeper meaning. "Your husband served during a crucial period in our history," Mitchell replied. "Those were not easy years for any serviceman. His dedication during that time helped maintain the stability and continuity that we still protect today." The crowd listened intently as Mitchell continued. Rather than focusing on Thompson's breach of protocol, he was honoring the memory of Private Harrison's service. This unexpected turn created a sense of anticipation among the observers, who began to realize that something even more extraordinary might be unfolding. "Sergeant Thompson," Mitchell said, turning back to his subordinate, "your actions today were highly irregular and completely contrary to established protocol." Thompson braced himself for the consequences, but Mitchell's tone remained measured, rather than condemning. "However," the lieutenant colonel continued, "sometimes the spirit of our service requires us to act beyond the letter of our regulations." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Mitchell was not condemning Thompson's actions but seemed to be validating them. This was unprecedented in the rigid hierarchy of military command, especially in such a public setting. Mitchell, then, did something that shocked even Thompson. He removed his own officer's cap and approached Margaret Harrison's wheelchair. "Mrs. Harrison," he said formally, "on behalf of Her Majesty's Guards, past and present, I want to express our gratitude for your husband's service and for the sacrifice you made as a military wife." The symbolism was powerful and immediate. Two serving officers, one of the highest and one of the enlisted ranks, had now both broken protocol to honor a veteran's widow. The message was clear. Sometimes human dignity and respect for service supersede military regulations. Margaret reached out to take Mitchell's hand, her voice stronger now as she spoke. "James would never have believed this. He always said the officers were too proper to notice the regular soldiers. But here you both are, showing more kindness than I ever expected." Her words highlighted one of the most significant aspects of what was occurring. Military hierarchy and class distinctions were being set aside in favor of mutual respect and shared understanding of service. The barriers between officer and enlisted, between past and present service, were dissolving in this moment of genuine human connection. David Harrison pulled out his phone and called his sister in Glasgow. "Sarah," he said emotionally, "you're not going to believe what's happening here. 2 guards have broken protocol to honor Dad's memory. Mum is crying, but they're tears of joy." The phone conversation was overheard by several tourists, who began to understand the broader significance of the moment. This wasn't just about one elderly woman's visit to the palace. It was about honoring all military families, all those who had served, and all those who had sacrificed for their country's security. Mitchell made another decision that would amplify the impact of this already extraordinary day. "Sergeant Thompson," he said, "I believe Mrs. Harrison would benefit from a brief tour of the guard post. Perhaps she would like to see where her husband once stood duty." This suggestion was revolutionary. Civilian access to guard positions was strictly controlled and rarely granted. But Mitchell recognized that this situation called for exceptional measures. Margaret Harrison represented more than just one visitor. She embodied the connection between the military's proud past and its continuing mission. Thompson's face lit up with understanding and gratitude. His commanding officer was not only excusing his breach of protocol, but was extending and amplifying it. Together, they would provide Margaret with an experience that would honor her husband's memory in a way that no regulation or procedure ever could. The crowd watched in amazement as the 2 soldiers carefully helped Margaret from her wheelchair and began to escort her toward the guard post. What had begun as a routine tourist visit to see the changing of the guard had evolved into something far more meaningful, a celebration of military service that bridged generations and ranks. As Margaret Harrison was carefully helped toward the guard post, word of the unprecedented events reached the highest levels of palace administration. Private Secretary Sir Edward Thornton, who had served the royal household for over 30 years, received an urgent call in his office overlooking the palace gardens. "Sir Edward," came the voice of Deputy Chief of Security, "we have an unusual situation at the front gates. 2 guards have broken protocol to honor an elderly veteran's widow. The crowd is growing, and there's significant social media attention." Thornton's first instinct was to order immediate restoration of proper protocol. The Queen's guards were symbols of unwavering discipline and tradition. Any deviation from established procedures could set dangerous precedents and undermine the dignity of the institution they protected. But as the security chief provided more details about Margaret Harrison and her late husband's service, Thornton found himself reconsidering. He had served long enough to understand that public perception and royal tradition sometimes required flexibility in applying rules. Moreover, the Queen herself had always emphasized the importance of honoring military service and sacrifice. Meanwhile, at the guard post, Thompson and Mitchell were providing Margaret with an experience that no civilian had received in decades. They showed her the exact position where guards stood during their duties, explained the significance of the various ceremonial elements, and shared stories of the dedication required to serve in this elite unit. "Your husband would have stood right here," Thompson explained, positioning Margaret at the precise spot where Private James Harrison had once maintained his vigil. He would have seen the same view of the palace courtyard, felt the same responsibility to protect what these buildings represent. Margaret placed her hand on the stone pillar beside the guard position, imagining her young husband standing in this exact location 60 years earlier. The connection to his memory felt tangible here, stronger than any photograph or story could provide. "James used to tell me about the weight of the responsibility," she said softly. "Not just the physical weight of the uniform and rifle, but the knowledge that centuries of tradition rested on each guard's shoulders. I never fully understood until now." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell nodded gravely. "Your husband understood something that takes many guards years to grasp. That we're not just protecting buildings or people, but safeguarding the continuity of our nation's story. Every guard who has stood here has been part of that larger narrative." The crowd that had gathered to watch this extraordinary scene continued to grow. Tour groups that had planned brief stops at the palace found themselves staying for hours, captivated by the unfolding drama of respect and recognition. Many visitors began sharing their own stories of military service, creating an impromptu community of people connected by service or appreciation for those who serve. David Harrison documented the experience with his phone, knowing that his sister and other family members would want to see every moment. But more importantly, he was capturing a piece of history, evidence that his father's service had been truly meaningful and was still remembered with respect and honor. Inside the palace, Sir Edward Thornton made a decision that would surprise many of his colleagues. Rather than ordering an immediate end to the protocol breach, he decided to allow events to continue unfolding naturally. He had realized that this spontaneous demonstration of respect was exactly the kind of public engagement that strengthened the bond between the royal institution and the people it served. Thornton placed a call to the Queen's private secretary, briefing her on the situation and recommending that they view it as a positive demonstration of the values the monarchy represented. The Queen, he knew, held deep respect for military service and would likely approve of guards showing honor to a veteran's family, even if it meant bending traditional protocol. The ripple effects of Thompson's initial gesture continued to expand. Other guards, witnessing the respectful reception their colleagues' actions had received, began to feel more connected to the human dimension of their service. They realized that their role was not just about maintaining rigid discipline, but about embodying the values of honor, respect, and service that their uniforms represented. Margaret, still standing at the guard post, turned to address the growing crowd. Her voice, though aged and somewhat frail, carried clearly in the afternoon air. "My husband served here because he believed in something bigger than himself," she said. "Today, these fine soldiers have shown me that spirit of service continues. They've honored not just James's memory, but the memory of every person who has worn this uniform." Her impromptu speech moved many in the crowd to tears. Here was a woman who had lived through the sacrifices of military life, who had raised children while her husband served his country, and who now, in her 90s, was receiving the recognition that military families deserved but rarely received. Thompson felt a profound sense of completion as he listened to Margaret's words. His decision to break character had been instinctive, driven by respect and compassion, but the consequences had far exceeded anything he could have imagined. What had begun as a simple gesture of recognition had become a celebration of military service that touched everyone present. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his rank, but also the warmth of genuine emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today you have witnessed something that reminds us why we serve. Mrs. Harrison represents thousands of military families who have made sacrifices for our nation's security. Her husband's service and her support of that service deserves our deepest respect." The crowd responded with spontaneous applause, recognizing that they had been privileged to witness something extraordinary. The formal changing of the guard ceremony they had come to see had been transformed into something far more meaningful, a demonstration of the human values that underlie military tradition and royal protocol. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the palace courtyard when an unexpected development added another layer to this already extraordinary day. A black limousine with royal insignia pulled up to the palace gates, and from it stepped Prince William, who had heard about the unprecedented events from his private secretary. The prince had been in London for other engagements when word reached him about the guard's respectful tribute to the veteran's widow. As someone who had served in the military himself and understood the importance of honoring service members and their families, he had decided to make an impromptu visit to meet Margaret Harrison personally. The crowd fell silent as they recognized the prince approaching. This was beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. Not only had two guards broken protocol to honor a veteran's memory, but now a member of the royal family was joining this spontaneous tribute. "Mrs. Harrison," Prince William said warmly, as he approached Margaret, who was still accompanied by Thompson and Mitchell. "I heard about your visit today and wanted to meet you personally. Your husband's service to the crown is deeply appreciated." Margaret, despite her age and the emotional toll of the day, maintained her composure with the dignity that had sustained her through decades of military life. "Your Highness," she replied, "this has been the most meaningful day of my life since James passed. These fine soldiers have shown such kindness." Prince William turned to Thompson and Mitchell, acknowledging their unprecedented actions. "Gentlemen," he said, "what you've done today demonstrates the very best of what military service represents. Sometimes the most important protocols are those written in the heart rather than in regulation books." The prince's words validated the guards' actions in a way that no military commendation could. By publicly supporting their decision to break character in order to show respect, he was establishing a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. Thompson, still somewhat stunned by the rapid escalation of events, managed to respond formally. "Your Highness, Mrs. Harrison's husband served with the same dedication that we try to maintain today. Honoring his memory felt more important than maintaining rigid protocol." Prince William nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of judgment and compassion we hope to see in those who serve the crown. Your actions today have honored not just Private Harrison's memory, but the entire tradition of service that connects past and present." The prince then made a suggestion that would create a lasting legacy from this spontaneous moment of respect. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, "I would like to invite you and your family to visit the palace for a formal recognition of your husband's service. We should ensure that his contribution and your sacrifices as a military wife are properly documented and honored." Margaret's eyes filled with tears once again, but these were tears of overwhelming gratitude and joy. The idea that her husband's service would receive formal recognition from the royal family exceeded her wildest dreams. David, standing beside his mother, could barely contain his own emotion at this unexpected honor. The crowd of tourists and onlookers watched in amazement as this impromptu ceremony continued to evolve. What had begun as a routine sightseeing visit had become a historic moment that would be remembered and retold for generations. Sir Edward Thornton, who had been monitoring the situation from his office, arrived at the scene just as Prince William was speaking with Margaret. His initial concerns about protocol breaches had been completely overshadowed by the positive public response and the prince's obvious approval of the guard's actions. "Your Highness," Thornton said as he approached, "the palace staff stands ready to arrange whatever recognition you deem appropriate for Mrs. Harrison and her late husband's service." Prince William smiled, recognizing that the palace administration was now fully supportive of this unprecedented demonstration of respect. "Excellent, Sir Edward. Let's ensure that this becomes an example of how we honor those who have served, not an exception to normal protocol." The prince's words indicated that this event might lead to broader changes in how the royal household approached military recognition and public engagement. The rigid adherence to protocol that had characterized royal procedures for centuries was being balanced with a more human, compassionate approach to honoring service and sacrifice. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell realized that this moment represented more than just recognition for one veteran's service. It was establishing a new precedent for how military personnel could balance duty with humanity, how regulations could be interpreted through the lens of honor and respect rather than rigid compliance. Margaret, still clutching the regimental badge Thompson had given her, addressed Prince William directly. "Your Highness, James always said that serving the crown meant protecting something precious. Today I've learned that what we protect isn't just buildings or traditions, but the values of respect, honor, and compassion that you've all shown me." Her words encapsulated the deeper meaning of what had occurred. The guard's decision to break character hadn't undermined their service. It had demonstrated the highest ideals of what service could represent. Prince William spent several more minutes speaking with Margaret, learning about her husband's service and her own experiences as a military wife. He asked thoughtful questions about the challenges military families faced and listened intently to her responses. The crowd began to understand that they were witnessing not just a spontaneous act of kindness, but a potential turning point in how military service was recognized and honored. The barriers between past and present, between different ranks and social positions, between rigid protocol and human compassion, were being reconsidered and redefined. As the afternoon drew toward evening, arrangements were made for Margaret's formal visit to the palace. The spontaneous tribute that had begun with Thompson's simple gesture of respect was now evolving into an official recognition that would honor not just Private James Harrison, but all military families who had made similar sacrifices. 3 weeks later, Margaret Harrison returned to Buckingham Palace, but this time she entered through the main gates as an honored guest, rather than as a tourist viewing from behind the railings. The formal recognition ceremony that Prince William had promised had been arranged with careful attention to both protocol and the personal meaning of the occasion. Margaret wore her finest dress, the same one she had worn to her husband's military retirement ceremony 40 years earlier. Pinned to her lapel was the regimental badge that Sergeant Thompson had given her, now polished to a brilliant shine. Beside her walked David and her daughter Sarah, who had flown down from Glasgow to witness this extraordinary culmination of their father's military legacy. Thompson and Mitchell, both in dress uniforms with full ceremonial decorations, were present as honored participants in the ceremony, rather than merely as guards on duty. Their decision to break protocol 3 weeks earlier had not resulted in disciplinary action, but had instead led to commendations for demonstrating the highest ideals of military service. The ceremony took place in the palace's white drawing room, a space typically reserved for the most significant state occasions. Prince William, representing the Queen, presided over the proceedings with a dignity that reflected the importance of honoring military service and sacrifice. "Mrs. Harrison," Prince William began, "we gather today not just to recognize your late husband's service to the crown, but to acknowledge the sacrifices made by all military families. Your strength and support enabled Private Harrison to serve with distinction, and that contribution deserves formal recognition." Margaret was presented with a certificate of appreciation signed by the Queen herself, acknowledging both James Harrison's service as a Queen's Guard and Margaret's role as a military wife. The document would become a treasured family heirloom, passing down through generations as proof that their ancestors' service had been truly valued. But the most meaningful moment came when Thompson and Mitchell were invited to present Margaret with a special gift from the Guards Regiment. It was a framed photograph of her husband's original unit, with James Harrison clearly visible among his fellow guards. The photograph had been discovered in the regimental archives and carefully restored for this presentation. "Mrs. Harrison," Thompson said as he presented the photograph, "your husband stands among heroes in this image. Every man in this photograph dedicated his life to service, but few left behind families who carried that spirit of service as gracefully as you have." Margaret studied the photograph through tears of joy, pointing out her young husband among the rows of uniformed soldiers. "There's my James," she whispered, looking so serious and proud. He would never have believed that his service would be remembered like this. The ceremony concluded with Prince William making an announcement that would ensure the day's significance extended far beyond one family's recognition. He declared the establishment of an annual award for military personnel who demonstrated exceptional compassion and humanity while maintaining their service duties. "The Thompson-Mitchell Award for Service Beyond Protocol," Prince William announced, "will recognize military personnel who, like Sergeant Thompson and Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, understand that the highest form of service sometimes requires us to act from the heart, as well as from regulations." Thompson and Mitchell exchanged glances of amazement and gratitude. Their names would be permanently associated with an award that celebrated the very values they had demonstrated that memorable afternoon at the palace gates. The story of their respectful tribute to Margaret Harrison had already spread far beyond London through social media and news coverage. Military personnel around the world had been inspired by their example, and several similar incidents of guards and soldiers showing compassion while on duty had been reported in other countries. Margaret's visit to the palace had lasting effects on everyone involved. Thompson completed his 15 years of service with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. Mitchell continued his military career with a renewed appreciation for the human dimension of leadership. Both men remained friends with Margaret and her family, visiting her regularly and ensuring that James Harrison's memory remained vivid and honored. The tourists who had witnessed the original event at the palace gates became inadvertent ambassadors for a more compassionate understanding of military service. Many shared their videos and photographs online, but more importantly, they carried with them a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made by military families. David Harrison used the experience to write a book about his father's military service and the extraordinary day when 2 guards honored his memory. The book became a bestseller, inspiring readers to recognize and appreciate the veterans and military families in their own communities. Margaret Harrison lived for 3 more years. After that memorable day, and according to her family, she spoke about the experience almost daily. The kindness shown by Thompson and Mitchell, and the formal recognition from Prince William, had given her a sense of completion regarding her husband's service that she had never expected to receive. When Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 96, Thompson and Mitchell served as honorary pallbearers at her funeral. The regimental badge she had treasured was buried with her, ensuring that the symbol of respect and recognition would remain with her forever. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people who had been touched by the story of the guards who broke character to show pure respect. Military personnel from various branches of service came to pay their respects, understanding that Margaret Harrison represented all military spouses who had supported their partner's service with quiet dignity and unwavering strength. In the years that followed, the Thompson-Mitchell Award became one of the most prestigious recognitions in British military service. Recipients were chosen not for battlefield heroics or technical excellence, but for demonstrating that true military honor sometimes required the courage to act with compassion and humanity, even when it meant setting aside rigid protocol. The legacy of that autumn afternoon at Buckingham Palace continued to influence military culture and royal protocol for decades to come. The Queen's Guards training program was updated to include instruction on recognizing when human compassion should take precedence over rigid adherence to rules, using Thompson and Mitchell's actions as a case study in exemplary service. Sergeant Thompson, after completing his military service, became a counselor for veterans and their families, using his experience to help others navigate the challenges of military life. He often told the story of meeting Margaret Harrison as an example of how a single moment of compassion could create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond what anyone could imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell rose through the ranks to become a senior commander, but he never forgot the lesson he learned that day about the importance of leading with both discipline and heart. He implemented training programs that emphasized the human dimension of military service, ensuring that future generations of soldiers understood that true strength came from combining professional excellence with genuine compassion. The Guard, post where Margaret Harrison had stood to honor her husband's memory, became an informal shrine for military families visiting the palace. While official tours didn't specifically mention the incident, guards on duty would often share the story with visitors who showed particular interest in the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard. Years later, when documentaries were made about the evolution of royal protocol and military tradition, the story of the guards who broke character to show pure respect was featured as a turning point in how institutions balanced tradition with humanity. Military historians noted that the incident marked the beginning of a more compassionate approach to service that spread throughout the British Armed Forces. The photograph of James Harrison's unit, which had been presented to Margaret during her formal recognition ceremony, was eventually donated to the Imperial War Museum, where it became part of an exhibit honoring ordinary soldiers who had served with extraordinary dedication. Visitors to the museum could read the story of how that photograph had been used to honor both a veteran's service and his widow's sacrifice. Margaret Harrison's story became more than just a touching anecdote about military respect. It became a symbol of how individual acts of kindness could transform institutions and inspire positive change across entire organizations. The guards who chose to honor her husband's memory had demonstrated that the highest form of service was not blind obedience to rules, but thoughtful application of the values those rules were meant to protect. In the end, the true victory was not just the recognition Margaret received, but the lasting change in how military service was understood and honored. Thompson and Mitchell's decision to break character had actually strengthened the character of military service itself, proving that rules exist to serve humanity, not the other way around. Their story became a testament to the power of individual conscience and the importance of acting with honor, even when, especially when, such action required personal courage and risk.